a good question to ask is what is this backlash that's happening against big tech and why?
Hi, I'm Talia Freed, and I'm Director of Education at Global Citizen, and you are listening to The Ed Show.
Welcome to that show, a podcast where I sit with some amazing personalities from across sectors and borders to have meaningful conversation on topics that matters to us. Welcome back. My guest for the day is someone who is an expert when it comes to business, human rights, and risk management. He is a well known name in UN organizations as he was a UN Special Mandate holder on business and human rights at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva and was also the head of food and agriculture at the UN Global Compact in New York. He is an architect by education who has also supported Malaysian conglomerate on corporate sustainability. He is the founder of Blue Number Foundation, a non-profit headquartered in New York, which is established to promote right-based approach to digital identity, data, and property rights. He is the most grounded and humble person I know and a great friend. He is Puvan J Selvanathan. Hi Puvan, welcome on the show.
Hi, Himanshu.
Puvan, many people consider that their digital identity is what they are on social media. Can you throw some light on what a digital identity actually means?
So there are different forms of digital identity. I mean, certainly every time you create a social media account, you are creating a form of digital identity. But that's not the same sort of identity as, for example, an Aadhaar card or a digital identity card or something which is issued by your government or a digital version of your driver's license. A social media account is really an expression of some form of social identity that you wish to present. So it is not really able to be validated or used, for example, to open a bank account or to actually create a degree of trust with other people, except for what you want to say. You are the only source of the information behind that identity. When we talk about digital identity in the broader sense, it actually should be able to appeal and to be used by many, many different stakeholders in different contexts. So, certainly, a social identity or a social media identity is one form, but its uses are actually very limited. Similarly, if we talk about the type of identity that I mentioned, which is issued by a regulator, that is also a form of identity, but it is also quite limited because sometimes the information contained in that identity may not be current. It may not actually be accurate with regard to, for example, where you live or where you're traveling to. So different identities have different footprints, different stakeholder groups, different uses. It's important when we get into the realm of digital identity that we understand exactly who is using that digital identity apart from you, who is issuing that digital identity, who is validating the digital identity, and then actually what value does that identity bring to you, to the stakeholders, to everybody who needs to use it.
Before we move forward, I just want you to address the elephant in the room, which is social media. One of the latest challenges that we have seen, and I'm sure that you are also aware of the fact as to how certain organizations and even political lobby plays with our emotion using social media. And one of the examples is the recent case of last election win and Cambridge Analytica involvement in manipulating the voters. Don't you feel that the use of social media, which was actually created to bring people closer, is now moved on to the next level, wherein we can actually see it as a threat, as it can not just manipulate us for buying certain products or services, but now it can also manipulate us for even being a part of societal discomfort, such as religious, gender, or color bias, or even more.
I mean, certainly, the extent to which technology is used, let's say for good or for evil, depends on who is doing the using. In the case of social media, and as you say, it was originally intended as a way to bring us all together to share, information about our communities, our preferences, and so forth. But inevitably, there were more uses to the information, the vast quantities of information that people were willingly uploading without much protection or care or actually understanding of the implications of what that data now presents and represents. So with social media over the last, let's say, 10 years, um, it kind of got away from itself. It's not the evil of social media in itself, but it's the monster that has been created. Now, the problem with social media, I think, when it comes to manipulating people, I mean, advertising has been manipulating people for decades. That's not new. Being able to push products or being able to influence people to make certain buying decisions is not new. What becomes insidious and what people find threatening is when concepts like democracy are being undermined because you're being manipulated in a particular way. So this is something which is relatively, I suppose, recent, last 10 years, or the last few election cycles, because the thing that makes us choose or buy politicians and politics and a way of life is just as much a commodity which can be sold as any other product. When this was realized by the social media giants, obviously they treat it as a product. They don't look at it as a way to manipulate an election. It's a way to influence a consumer for a choice of politics, which is a product. So I think we have to be careful when we, point the fingers in a kind of a pejorative manner. At the end of the day, we choose what we put on our social media or not. We choose how it is that we wish to be influenced. We can always say no, but of course, it's a very compelling situation now where people don't really want to let go of their social media. They're so used to the benefits and the connectivity and the friends. And maybe the thing to step back is and to take a look at this kind of scenario we've built is to ask, is it really delivering the types of benefits that we want? And if it's not, just stop.
I read the Cambridge Analytica statistics when they had mentioned that they had captured 5,000 data points on every individual in the United States. And as per the Fox News, today Facebook might have 29,000 data points on every individual. And as per research, these companies may have around 70,000 data points on any individual in the next few years. How do you see it as a threat and simultaneously as an opportunity?
Okay, I mean, I think the number of data points in and of itself is probably just a matter of time. I mean, at the time that Cambridge Analytica was doing its thing, they only had 5,000 data points. And then if you now look at every one of those data points being appended or enhanced, you're probably going to get,
Today we are at around 29,000 data points.
exactly. So, that's probably just shall we say, a linear progression from the first 5,000. I think that, the reality of it would be, um, and to come back to the question of threat, the threat would be which data points are being used to create what sort of influence? And is that an influence that we are unaware of? I mean, I think one of the problems with Cambridge Analytica, um, and in fact, even prior to Cambridge Analytica, were for example, the Five Eyes program, which Snowden and all of the WikiLeaks documents and so forth. It was actually kind of going behind our backs to do things. That was the thing I think which most people found very uncomfortable, is that we didn't know. And simply and again with Analytica, the way that they went in and got the data points by actually asking other things, and collating the data points through things like games and surveys and so forth, without an explicit or even a marginal kind of informed consent. That was really the quote unquote bad thing. Now, if today you are being asked a survey about your political choices, and you are then answering that survey honestly, and let's say you're even being paid for it, now that would be pretty above board, and I think a lot of people would probably have no objection to that because it's transparent. But I think with the early days of this kind of manipulation, people felt, Analytica and others probably felt that being surreptitious or being able to mine the data is a valid way of going about things, when that actually isn't. But I think the actual point of having data and being able to glean certain insights and analytics and so forth, I mean, that's just the nature of data, and it's the nature of the permissions that people give. It's just that when it's given unknowingly, or without proper information as to what it's going to be used for, then it becomes a problem, and that's the threat.
Today you see any social media platform and the kind of information they show us on our wall.
Hmm.
Don't you feel that this is a kind of intrusion in my private space? And having my touch points by social media monster is against my digital rights?
Okay, so when it comes to privacy, I mean, this is an interesting concept, and especially, of course, one which is at the heart of digital identity. I mean, the nature of privacy, of course, in itself has changed because we are now all in the digital realm. So let's say that we exist because of our data. Today, we have access to many products and services primarily that depend on a certain digital footprint that we have somewhere, somebody's database somewhere. The question of privacy can really only be enforced if we know exactly where that data is and what it is that we own. So let's imagine, you have a house, okay, or you have a car. Somebody can't break into your house because you have, property right to that house. So you know that that house is yours. And if somebody breaks into it and starts stealing stuff or taking photos and whatever it's going to be, you have recourse because there are laws to protect you because you own it. The thing that stops somebody else from taking your stuff is your property right. Now, if you think about data, there is no such thing. You do not own the data that is put on a wall on your social media account. The social media company owns it. They can even say that actually your data with regard to your identity as issued by the government, they don't know that because when you created your social media account, you did not have to upload your birth certificate. You do not have to upload your passport or your Aadhaar card or anything like that. I mean, they will take you at your word with regard to who you say you are. And then you create a wall and you start posting photos and you do this, that, and the other. And so, as far as they are concerned, this bundle of data is an identity, not your identity. It's an identity. And what they have given you in terms of the tools to be able to present that identity is means that you are just creating content. So you don't own that. So in reality, how you are going to push back with an idea like privacy is actually very difficult. There's no recourse to it whatsoever. And I'm saying this in simple terms, but you take what I'm saying simply and you expand it into a 200-page contract, and that's the thing that you don't read when you click I agree at the beginning. So it's all there, and privacy is explicitly excluded when you get to that point.
True. True. And do you feel that today you are kind of defined by what your digital footprints are, and that has actually become your actual identity?
Absolutely. I mean, that is actually the premise of much of the work that I'm doing now, is that let's assume that it is inevitable that within a very short space of time, everybody will have some form of digital footprint. Now, the question is whether or not they are able to access and manage that digital footprint. Why I say that everybody will is because almost every government in the world is using some form of digital management for their identities, even if they don't have digital identities. Like, for example, in India, where you actually have a physical expression of a digital identity in the Aadhaar card, there will be a database somewhere which qualifies whether you are a citizen of that country or whether you pay taxes or whether all sorts of things. So almost all data today is no longer analog; it is digital. Therefore, if you exist somewhere, you must be in digital form somewhere, whether you know it or not. The way that we'll be progressing with identity is more and more how you become aware of what exists digitally about you, and then how you can begin to control or be selective about who gets to see what about your identity. But we've already gone past the point where you can be off the grid. That's just not happening. I mean, it's that's the past.
I completely agree that digital identity has opened our doors for various possibilities. And in the same context, when we are talking about identity, then we have also heard about malware or hacking threats. But today, at a point when even countries feel pride in becoming almost 100% digital, then this actually exposes to another threat, which are far more serious and heinous. And one such threat is synthetic identity fraud. Can you throw some light on this and how actually we can safeguard ourselves from such threats?
But what's the difference between? I mean, I'll ask you the question. What's the difference between synthetic identity fraud and somebody forging your passport and traveling?
Synthetic identity fraud has a much bigger impact than document forging.
You mean they can do more harm?
Exactly.
Yeah, but isn't doing any harm bad?
Doing any harm is bad.
Yeah, so so now we're talking about degrees of harm. I mean, the point is that ironically, if somebody were to create a synthetic identity for you, you actually have no recourse because they haven't broken any laws. If somebody were to forge your passport, they've actually broken a law. So, interestingly enough, the protections that exist for what would be a lesser scale of harm, in other words, forging a passport, actually carries more penalties and can be prosecuted. Whereas what you say, the wider scope of harm, which is your digital identity and your synthetic identity, actually has no protections whatsoever. So that's the kind of concern that we need to be looking at when we talk about digital identity. And I think the concept of being able to protect your identity or to be able to vest the protection of your identity in a third party is actually false. We can't support that theory because if you think about internet principles, the only thing you can do is to build a better verification or audit trail process that increases the probability that your identity is authentic. But there will never be a definitive position that says, I can say this is you.
So true. And how, according to you, an individual or an organization can control their digital footprints and how they can safeguard themselves from the digital identity fraud?
Well, actually, I think that any intermediary between the system, the internet, with a big I, and the individual is prone to vulnerability. So I don't think we should be vesting our hopes and our trust in any intermediary, whether it's a private organization or whether it's government. That simply is not viable. We need to develop one-to-one relationships with the system of our data, where the data is stored, how it's being processed, and so forth. So, even in the work that we're doing at Blue Number, we're essentially trying to say that, the identity, a digital identity has two components. One is a a technical or a technological component, which is, let's say, how the identities manifest, where you see it, and so forth. But more importantly, it's the ability for us to govern that identity with a body and a suite of regulations, legislations, what our society expects the digital identity to convey, to be protected from. That's not technical. That's what we agree on. And the loophole or the lacuna here is that there's no agreement, primarily between states, because governments really want to control identity as they have been doing since states were formed.
So, how important is it to understand digital rights and digital freedom, and how one can safeguard themselves from being manipulated or being trapped in the lacunas or such concerns that you have just raised?
Yeah, so, well, I mean, the first thing is to understand whom it is that you are trying to be protected from. I mean, why a good question to ask is, what is this backlash that's happening against big tech, and why? Okay, and this has happened a few times before. Um, when you see Congress or the EU going after big tech in this way, it's very similar to, let's say, 10 years ago when people went after the phone companies, which had a lot of records, especially mobile phone companies. And then you have legislation that says that you can't get a prepaid card without certain forms of identity and so forth. Prior to that, you had legislation against vehicle ownership, against property, against land. As soon as there becomes some record of information or data that is beyond what the government has, then the government pushes back. And that's what you're seeing now happening. And actually, in the financial world, you will recall maybe at the early days of crypto, there was a big pushback from the traditional banks. But now, every bank is also using some form of crypto. If you imagine before, there was, the telcos were obsessed with not having or not giving access to VoIP because they were charging for traditional lines. Now every telco basically resells VoIP in one form or another. And even for a while there, they were actually charging us normal prices, but using VoIP behind us. So all we're looking at is the change of systems between one to another. Now, I'm not defending big tech in any way. Certainly, what they've done is they've created a business model where the manipulation of people is actually very profitable. My interest is why we think that having privacy against big tech protects us from privacy against any other stakeholder. Because in any given situation, let's say we look at WhatsApp, you have end-to-end encryption between, let's say, if I send you a WhatsApp, there's you, me, and Facebook in the conversation, right? These are the three people who actually theoretically could, well, if we believe everything on the screen, we are the three people who would be able to access something. And the one who is actually assuring that it's end-to-end encryption is Facebook. In the same way, with all our other data, there's you, me, and our government. So why would we say, for example, it's okay for the government to have the final arbitration on our data and they can protect our privacy as opposed to Facebook? Now, certainly I don't even have a Facebook account. I mean, I do, but I don't, it's more through the company. I don't manage or do anything with it. But I think that, we must be aware of whom it is that we are vesting our trust in and why. And that's the concern. That's where, I think privacy and threats exist.
As you have rightly mentioned about telecom companies or financial institutions, and the government has actually tried to enforce certain law and legislation. But at the same time, these organizations are curating our digital footprints. And we certainly understand that this is our future. But don't you feel that we are still exposed to various threats, including phishing, scam, data theft, protection legislation, and more?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, as soon as you have, any kind of channel, whether it's analog or whether it's digital, you're going to be exposed to threats. I do think that there's been a lot of scaremongering because most people don't understand technology. Now, I think with any degree of threat or with any degree of manipulation, one thing to ask would be, what's the payoff? What's the motive? So when we looked at, for example, the telco thing, which Snowden revealed, and which we discussed a little bit earlier. I mean, for me, if somebody had, Verizon or somebody had kind of called up and said, "Hey, listen, I want to be able to, to access all your phone records and know everybody you've called, and be able to use that for AI, and I'll give you a $10 rebate a month on your bill if you let me do it." Chances are I would have said okay. And chances are almost everybody would have said okay, because there was a quid pro quo there. I don't care who's looking at my phone accounts because I don't actually have any secrets, whoever it is they're calling. So if you are suddenly going to pay me $10 or give me a rebate of $10, why not? So the question here, I think, also goes back to being able to make informed consent. If we create the specter of existential threats, something out there is going to harm us. Yeah, for sure. But the things which are going to harm you, you would never be able to work out in advance. Um, Actually, for that Snowden thing, it was very interesting. There was one interview that was given by um, a British major who was running GCHQ, the British government's kind of spying center on data center, and he was on the BBC, and he basically gave this interview, and he said, he was shocked that people didn't think this was already happening because it had already appeared in so many movies and it was presented as fiction. I mean, granted, he never had another interview again because obviously he was pulled out, from the government, from by the government from speaking on air. But I'm also shocked when people actually think, why don't you think that the worst things that you can possibly imagine are already happening? Because they are.
Now, when we talk about the whistleblowers
Yeah.
or people who want to reach out on public platforms to speak about the evil or wrongdoing happening in the digital space, don't you feel that they kind of create a buzz? But then the problem that they face is that the bigger organizations or even political machinery stops them from widespreading their information, and that's why majority of our people are not aware about such issues and challenges, and they are still trying to get on these social media platforms and are unknowingly leaving their digital footprints without even realizing that this can also possess a threat for themselves.
Yes, but I mean, what are you? How do you? So I mean, so this actually takes us to a to a very interesting um, discussion about digital development and digital divide. If we are actually moving towards an area where our entire life is going to be governed or is already governed by, um, uh, you know, the digital process and the digital realm, surely one of the things that we really should be educating everybody about, like kids from day one in kindergarten, is your digital footprint. Why is it that we are still, that there are so many situations where this is kept as though it is an add-on to life as opposed to the center of life? We cannot imagine a situation, moving forward where some kind of digital footprint is not going to be at the core of your identity. Therefore, in the same way that a child knows as soon as they can, that there are certain documents and other things which, their parents keep, which they have to show in certain places. Why is it that the child who can now, for example, as soon as they're 8 or 9 years old, can get a smartphone, but they're not told or not educated properly as to what the consequences of usage of that smartphone in particular ways means? This is simply, seems to be um, where we are behind on the curve with regard to the position of how the centrality of digitization is in our society. We are simply not keeping pace with having those things available.
In the recent past, I have also seen that there are a few companies which have tried to bend the rule and are trying to create the ethical digital space, and even you are one of them. But don't you feel that there is a pushback from the large corporation or even political machinery, as for them, ethical organization is a threat?
Sure. I mean, ethics has never been a particularly profitable enterprise. History has shown. But at the end, um, shall we say, self-enlightened um, responsibility will win out because the, and I'm not necessarily saying it's going to happen in quote unquote my digital lifetime, but the normalization of the the benefits when it becomes unprofitable to to manipulate and to steal this sort of thing, data and people's identities, then you will suddenly see the incidence of it go down, and ethical companies like like ours or organizations like ours, um, will just have been the guys who wrote some of the rules, hopefully, or contributed to some of that thinking. But pushback is inevitable. I mean, anything which is going to come with a lot of vested interests, whether it's going to be government or whether it's going to be food and ag players that have got supply chains that were actually created just after the Second World War, but are still great polluters of all sorts of things. Plastic in the ocean. These are all simply residuals of a time and systems which are which everybody agrees is out of date, but trying to slow the inertia of these bad habits, which have been kind of ingrained on a global level. And that also includes keeping people in the dark, which is a control, a power play, it's inevitable. So you are going to get. I suppose the benefit of it is this, that at least in this environment, you even know about companies like ours or organizations like ours. Um, 10, 15 years ago, we wouldn't have even had the very same means, the internets and the platforms and so forth, to even talk about, what would be an ethical position for this conundrum that we are in.
And do you feel that before allowing our kids on digital platforms, and I'm not just referring to social media, I'm rather talking about the entire digital space, that before allowing our kids to be on digital platform, we must first empower them with the understanding of deciding between the right and wrongs, and with the ethics and values of being on the digital platform, so that they understand what they are doing instead of falling in the compulsive trap laid by the society.
Yeah, I you see. I would have stopped you actually just after digital, just after right and wrong. Whether it's on a digital platform or whether it's in real life, what difference does it make? The problem is that people, who are older, um, don't take the time and trouble to vest good habits and good thinking and the wisdom to know the difference between right and wrong. And that's just education. It doesn't matter whether it's digital or whether it's any other form. So certainly, I would absolutely agree. You need to we have a responsibility as people who know a little bit more because we've been around a bit longer to help people who are younger understand the implications. But the decisions that they're going to make with technologies that we never had, I I often with my wife, for example, we used to have discussions about how much screen time was appropriate for our daughters. I now have two daughters who are 18 and 19 years old, but at the time, let's say 6 7 years ago, it was always an issue as to how much screen time, what are they looking at, putting in filters, blah blah blah, and all this, and I actually resisted that temptation to impose my set of pre-digital values into the the future of what these kids would be doing. In the same way that when I was a teenager or when I was a younger person, I made mistakes and I learned from the mistakes. And those were analog mistakes, driving the car badly or, uh, you know, um, uh, just doing bad things. I mean, I can't remember all of them because there were too many. But there will be digital mistakes today. And I think it's the peer group, of my daughters and their peer group who have to learn what those mistakes are, and they can be helped. But what they need to do is to be able to have a sense of right and wrong and to be able to make that judgment. And whether it's digital, you're looking at something on the screen. Is this an appropriate image? Is this, a type of hate? Are we victimizing somebody? Do I now learn something about a supply chain which gives me the power to not buy that product? Do I know what that means? These are not necessarily digital things. In fact, if anything, the digital realm should help the next generation or the younger generation make better decisions because they have more information at their fingertips. The question is how to use the information and ascribe them to a set of values, and that's our responsibility as older people.
Even the value education has to be at the forefront, and I always advocate that. And here I'm not just talking about the understanding of basic right and wrong, because in a normal world, one can judge the right and wrong through the senses. But when we talk about digital footprints, then the majority of the things are unseen. As what kind of data points the organizations are capturing and how they're actually manipulating us using the same data points. And this is why I actually keep it a little different from the analog system. As just to give you an example, if a friend of mine is into wrongdoing, then I have the power to choose between the right and wrong for me. But when I don't know how I am leaving my digital footprints and how these giants are manipulating me using my digital footprints, then what can I do to safeguard myself as a kid or as a teenager?
No, nothing, because you don't know. I mean, you can only react, as you say, in the analog world, it's based on your senses. And in the digital world, it's based on the processing of information. And I think, kids these days, I sound like a super old guy, but, people who understand how to use devices, you know, um, people who understand how to use devices to a different level, I think also appreciate in a different way the nature of information. So I wouldn't presume to act as a proxy sensor on systems that I don't understand. I think that the people who will have to organize their lives in a digital fashion will be those who grew up in the digital environment entirely. So the best we can do, as the outgoing generation of pre-digital. I mean, and I think we are the ones who are kind of living at the cusp between the analog and the digital era. The best we can do is to take over or to convey the values, because that I think is will be material in whichever world. But for me to presume that I could tell somebody who was kind of born with a smartphone in their hand um, how to understand information by my limited understanding of it, it's going to be very, very difficult. I mean, I bought kids, iPads for my kids when they were very, very young, and I consciously didn't, use show them how to use it, other than press this button. It was very much the approach of, well, let's see. And of course, maybe I was interested in experimenting a bit with, with the children, but it was kind of like that. And now I look at the way that that they use devices, um, and it's highly intuitive. So that intuition, I think, arises from just a different capacity to be able to process information and the way that information is collected, harnessed, and presented or represented, which is beyond me.
Well, don't you actually feel that the millennials are actually the guinea pigs of these tech laboratories? And I'm not just talking from the threats or theft point of view, or even the identity fraud point of view. Uh, but as millennials, millennials are living in an era wherein if they don't get likes or comments on their post, then they commit suicide. And this is not just ethical or value disconnect, but this is actually creating mental traumas.
Yeah, I think that so okay, then maybe we should kind of rephrase that. We've basically got two generations that are at the cusp. I think that millennials, and I'm currently watching this was it Emily in Paris, um, which is interesting because I'm actually watching it to kind of understand a little better what millennials think of their first kind of like real world experience or jobs, and it's not real at all, but it's interesting and it's somewhat entertaining. The difference I think between millennials and, let's say, my generation would be the value set. I think that we didn't do a particularly good job of recognizing, as in my generation, how important the values, the non-digital values, were. And so, I remember, what it was like and how important it was for my dad to have a job and to go to work. Um, and that kind of the stability or the regularity of what was a nuclear family. These concepts have totally disappeared in the last like 10, 15 years, at least in the developed world. So, you've got, and as we move more towards, shall we say, the fragmentation of a digital environment, it's going to get um, more difficult to understand. It's not better or worse, it's just the way it is. So it's like, when we look at the new normal, and people are talking about the new normal here with post COVID, I mean, we've been living the new normal for the last 10, 15 years while we've been trying to assess what the hell's going on with the internet. So I think that the millennials certainly are not having an easy time, but I also think that we can't prejudge what are the challenges they're going to face, because they're certainly not the challenges that we didn't face. I mean, like, I would be less concerned now if a millennial, for example, didn't have, quote unquote, a steady job, because We've been through the gig economy. We've been through whatever type of work from home economy we're having now. I don't even know what's going to happen, like, next Tuesday. So who am I to be able to pass judgment on whether a millennial is making the right decision or not because they need 2,000 likes on a particular photo? Maybe that's the way things are going to pan out. We're still in a situation of flux, I think, and um, I don't mean to be ambiguous or kind of vague, but I think we need to be conscious of what can we actually control. Um, and I don't think the millennials and the way they think, I mean, that's been proven time and time again. Um, we certainly can't control that.
Absolutely, absolutely. I agree. I agree that we cannot control that, but according to you, what should be the way forward for digital footprints, and how different individuals or industries can use digital footprints in the ethical and the right way, which is, maybe to boost the economy or to boost their own employee engagement, or maybe to reduce the inequalities or bridging the gender gap, or any other sustainable development issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think that all of these issues come down to the sort of the fundamental way that we have recognized value in other products and services. I mean, this is not a new thing that we're trying to work out. At some point, we're going to say that, listen, there's an asset that is being created, and that's a digital asset. Your digital identity, and we're not necessarily talking about health records or that sort of thing. We're talking about the fact that if you are posting to social media, what you're really doing is you are creating content that can be monetized by other people. You're actually generating an output, which is a monetizable output. Now, once we start recognizing that doing work and not getting paid for it, or being indentured into something, is a form of slavery, then essentially we are all data slaves at the moment to social media, right? That is, we got over slavery by recognizing that everybody should get paid fairly for their work. We got over food safety by recognizing that we should have minimum standards by which there should be sanitary and hygiene that's going into processing plants. We are getting over now the idea that we can't be exploiting ecosystem services endlessly without consequences to our environment. Black Lives Matter is getting over the fact that there is ingrained intolerance based on the color of people's skin. So there is always a time at which we will get over certain things. But in reality, if I look at the Black Lives Matter situation, once again, I'm not American, I'm Malaysian, but I'm proud of the fact that somebody is kind of doing the work for us there. If I think about Malaysia and its ingrained racism, if I think about the UK and its ingrained classism, if I think about India and the spectrum of issues, whether it's from class to religion. So these are only three countries. Every country has its own kind of quirks as to what is tolerated or not. So we should thank those guys who are breaking down um, the the barriers of talking about things and calling out the injustices, the data slavery injustices. It's the American big tech companies against the American Congress. Black Lives Matter. It's about reparations in the U.S. Against the U.S. Constitution, against freedom, justice, liberty, and all of those things. Like it or not, even the fact that Trump could get elected and may get elected again, but the fact that he could in a place like that tells us one thing, which is democracy, like in its most raw form, kind of prevails. But what we realized there, of course, was that the popular vote doesn't translate into the electoral college. So if I was the US, I mean, obviously I'm not, but if I was, then the first thing I want to do is to go back and look at that system. But these ideas of changing, the way that we operate as a global society, or a society, and now a global society, especially when you move into the digital realm, um, we'll get over it. But there's going to be some pain and suffering while we do. I mean, everything requires revolution, right?
And what do you have to say about these companies which have recently started mushrooming and are trying to create next Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg and are actually manipulating with the brains of 6 year olds?
Um, yes, but am I surprised? No. And do I think that it can be controlled? Yes. But the will to control it um, has to come in the same way as would you be marketing sugary foods to a 6-year-old child? There's no difference. I mean, I grew up in the UK, and I remember that there were very strict rules about what could be advertised to children on Saturday morning during, Saturday cartoons. Um, and no sugary foods, no kind of like toys with guns, that sort of thing. And as soon as we see that there are certain implications and society wants to do something about it, then they will. Um, what's happening with big tech now is that they have gone so far ahead because governments don't understand internet speed that now Congress and everyone else are trying to play catch up. So yes, I agree that the 6-year-olds should be protected from those companies. Similarly, um, the 6 or the 10-year-olds or the 15-year-olds need to know what are the implications of putting up content on TikTok. But as you see, it's really not that easy once it becomes part of a socio-cultural phenomenon. And again, the pushback then comes not from, shall we say, the good and ethical people who realize the problems. It's actually from the populists who are afraid of cutting off that TikTok feed because they'll lose the votes of the people who are using TikTok and like it. So again, it's politics and will. I don't know if the will is there to be able to stop the manipulation.
And why do we have to get over with the digital platforms? We just need to learn how to use them wisely, isn't it?
Correct.
And at the same time, there are many organizations which are actually creating ethical platforms for the benefit of the society. And we have one such example, which is your organization, Blue Number. Why don't you share some information about Blue Number Foundation and how this can also be replicated in other industries?
Absolutely. I mean, so and the thinking behind Blue Number, as a foundation, it is a non-profit. We set up in New York after I left the UN. I mean, that was really because when I was at the UN, we had I was involved in two streams of work, both of which were wicked problems. Global challenges, human rights as a problem, and food security as a problem. Um, and when you combine these two problems, you realize, or at least I realized that, the unit of analysis that we're looking at, the person who is typically both hungry as well as denied rights, tends to be those people in rural areas, marginalized communities, vulnerable people. And now, I suppose already when I say these words, people are imagining, let's say, some indigenous person in a forest somewhere. But actually, we've got like 1.5 billion of these people, and they serve our food system. They are all the small farmers and their families, whose names we don't know. They are the 90 plus percent of people who exist, on a subsistence or a contract farming basis. They are the ones whose goods do not go across borders, but actually supply local, villages and keep the local economy going. So when I created Blue Number Foundation, for me it was important that this group of people who already have transactions and are part of an economy actually get the dignity of recognition. And if I was looking at the global south and looking a little bit ahead, 5 years ago, I said, look, everybody's going to have a smartphone. Why do we keep trying to design systems where we are not encompassing, the wave that is happening anyway? It is inevitable that digital identity is going to be part of everybody's persona, everybody's makeup. You're going to be born with a digital ID soon enough. And so, what you really need to have is the right to have that identity within your own sphere of influence. So, it's a global democracy, it's a globalization of the idea of identity. Um, I just, I don't believe that we as people should be should suffer the limitations that the things that we produce don't have. I could be growing something in Africa, and that product can travel freely to other countries. That product can clear licenses. That product can be exchanged for cash. But I myself will probably live and die within 5 kilometers of where I was born. And for me, that seems fundamentally wrong. If we don't have the liberty of movement and the liberty of presence that our goods and services have, then there's a real problem with the way that we see global society. Digital identity then gives us this identity, this opportunity that even if we can't move physically, then our digital persona should not be constrained by the limitations of the past, which could be our physical body. And what kind of challenges me is that we have this wonderful open platform like the internet, and we're trying to put restrictions on it that emulate a world that didn't really succeed. We are trying to create the barriers that we have in the physical world and put them into the digital space. And that just seems like, sort of remarkably wrong to me. And hence why Blue Number is an identity for global citizenship. It confers property rights to your data. Whether it is recognized in the same way as governments do and so forth, that's a different question. But somebody's got to get out there and say, okay, I respect the fact that you are who you claim to be. I don't need to know anything more than that. That's like social media. But you also, if you want to have the probability of being proven to be who you claim you are, bring all of your peers to come in and recognize you. Again, like social media. But the value and the difference is that you are bringing in peers who are probably transacting with you. So now you have a trust system that is being built up. You add, tokenization, you add crypto, you add this and the other. You can actually build an entire economy with your digital identity without necessarily having to, worry about real world barriers. And that's the trajectory of Blue Number, I hope. That's what we're trying to do.
Well, this is interesting. And I'm sure that in the days to come, we will see many organizations using digital space for the benefit of our societies and even, for boosting the economy.
I hope so.
And with this, it's time to say goodbye to you, my friend. It was pleasure having you on the show, Puvan.
Thank you. Thanks for the conversation. I very much appreciate that.
I hope that you all have enjoyed listening to this fun and meaningful conversation with Puvan Selvanathan. If you have liked this conversation, then do rate us on Apple Podcasts and share it with your network. And we will meet again in the next episode with another amazing guest. Thank you for listening to The TEDS Show. You can now listen to the same podcast on Apple and Google Podcasts, or you can watch it live on YouTube. And I'll see you in the next episode. Till then, stay safe and stay happy.